A racist man dared to raise a hand against Big Shaq's daughter. Mid-air, mid-flight, mid-crime. Seconds later, the cabin turned into a war zone as her bodyguards stormed the aisle, forcing an emergency diversion. No one on board would forget. What followed wasn't turbulence, it was justice, in flight, and undeniable. Racist man slaps Big Shaq's daughter. Flight diverted as her bodyguards stormed the cabin. This isn't just an incident, it's a skybound reckoning that shook the nation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal ducked slightly as he stepped into the narrow jet bridge, even though the ceiling was high enough. Some habits never left him, especially when you've been larger than life your whole career. Towering at 7 when he was impossible to miss. But it wasn't the kind of attention he ever grew fond of. Behind him walked his 17-year-old daughter, Aaliyah O'Neal, confident, elegant, with the poise of someone raised under a spotlight, yet fighting to own her space in it. The sun glared across the tarmac outside as the flight crew welcomed passengers aboard with forced smiles and perfunctory greetings. "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neal," one of the attendants stammered, flustered. He nodded politely, hand lightly touching the brim of his cap. Aaliyah gave a half-smile as they turned down the aisle toward first class, unaware of the storm about to gather above the clouds. Shaq felt it before he saw it. That familiar shift in the air, a discomfort that had nothing to do with the recycled oxygen. Whispers not loud but sharp enough to prick the skin. A couple clutched their designer bags a little closer. An older man leaned sideways to get a better look, mouth tight. Shaq scanned the cabin with casual eyes, but the weight of the stairs was as present as the seatbelts across their laps. Aaliyah walked ahead, earbuds in, oblivious, or maybe just pretending to be. She had inherited that much from her father, the art of selective perception, but he saw the way her shoulders tightened slightly, the way her hand hovered just a second longer over the armrest before sitting. She noticed. Of course she noticed. They took their seats in the front row, window and aisle, with a cushion of privacy that first class promised. But privacy was a myth for someone like Shaq, more myth than reality, especially for a black man with a name known in every household, and a face seen in every commercial break. 3 rows behind, in 2D, sat Carter Winslow, Wall Street royalty, with a jaw that never unclenched and eyes that scanned people like balance sheets. His Rolex glinted as he sipped mineral water, tapping an impatient finger against his tray table. He leaned toward his seatmate, a woman who nodded too eagerly, and whispered something behind the rim of his glass. She chuckled, eyes darting toward Aaliyah. Whatever he said, it wasn't kind. Shaq noticed. He always noticed. He'd learned not to react immediately. A lesson tattooed deep, from years of being the bigger person, literally and figuratively. But his daughter was involved now, and fatherhood had a way of rattling even the most tempered steel. Aaliyah leaned toward the window, gaze fixed on the tarmac. Her fingers fiddled with the drawstrings of her hoodie. Shaq reached out, placed a hand over hers. Heavy but warm, she turned to him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, mixed with uncertainty. "They don't know you," he said softly. "So they guess. Let 'em guess wrong." She smiled faintly, but the tension didn't fade. Shaq reclined slightly, closed his eyes, and breathed deep. He tried not to let Carter's voice creep under his skin, but he could still hear the man muttering behind him, not even trying to be discreet now. "Airlines used to have standards," Carter muttered. "Now it's all flash and flesh. No class." Shaq's body tensed, but he said nothing. Aaliyah shot a glance behind them, but Shaq caught her gaze. "Don't. Not yet." The plane taxied toward the runway, engines humming louder. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, running through pre-flight protocol. As the wheels lifted off, Shaq leaned back and tried to focus on the familiar sensation of ascent. Aaliyah pulled her hoodie up, pretending to sleep, but Shaq could feel the storm forming behind her closed eyelids. She was young, yes, but not soft. Life had taught her enough already to know that kindness wasn't always the first language spoken when you looked like them. Carter reclined his seat obnoxiously far, nearly bumping Aaliyah's knees. She shifted uncomfortably. Shaq tapped the call button. A flight attendant arrived, chipper and nervous. "Everything all right, Mr. O'Neal?" "Yeah," Shaq said calmly. "Seat's a bit tight for her back there. Could you just ask him to adjust slightly?" The attendant nodded and turned toward Carter. "Sir, would you mind? I paid for this seat," Carter snapped. If they wanted space, maybe they should have booked a private jet. The words landed with a thud. The attendant stepped back, helpless. Shaq nodded once. Noted. He could feel his daughter stiffen. Her breathing changed. He whispered low, "Let it go, Lee. Don't let small men pull you out of your place." But she didn't speak. Not yet. The sky outside turned a brilliant, searing blue. The sun bathed the cabin, in a brightness that seemed at odds with the chill inside. Shaq closed his eyes again, but Carter's voice crept in once more. "I don't care who he is. Fame doesn't buy civility." Shaq opened his eyes. He looked forward, not back, but his voice cut through the air like a skeletal. "Neither does money." Carter didn't reply, but the silence was sharper now, a blade waiting for the right moment. Shaq knew this wouldn't end quietly, and deep down, part of him knew it wasn't meant to. They had barely reached cruising altitude, but the tension had already taken off. And somewhere behind the hum of the engines, behind the whispers and tightening smiles, behind the silence sitting like a boulder on Shaq's chest, something ugly had begun to wake, and it would demand to be seen. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, and the cabin eased into a fragile rhythm. Passengers shifted, stretched, ordered drinks. The flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisle, tray carts rattling just slightly against the carpeted floor. Shaq watched his daughter from the corner of his eye, noting how she tugged her sleeves down, tensed her jaw and tried to pretend none of it touched her. But he knew better. He'd been that age once, caught between pride and pain, unsure whether to stand tall or shrink small just to get through the moment. Aaliyah pulled out her phone and flicked through her playlist. Shaq leaned back in his seat, his massive frame barely fitting despite the first-class accommodations. He let his eyes rest but kept his mind sharp. He wasn't naive. He knew people watched, judged, waited. Being a celebrity was one thing. Being a black celebrity traveling through spaces of wealth, power and privilege was another. It meant you had to measure every move, every word, because the smallest crack could be all they needed to tear you down. The clatter of ice in a glass jolted him slightly. A young flight attendant approached, smiling nervously, balancing 2 drinks on a small tray, orange juice for Aaliyah, sparkling water for Shaq. Her hand trembled, just a little, and as she leaned over, the tray tipped, the glass slipped, and a cold splash of sticky juice hit Aaliyah's jeans and hoodie. She gasped softly, pushing back, eyes wide. The attendant paled, stammering apologies, fumbling for napkin. "It's okay," Aaliyah mumbled, wiping at her clothes, cheeks flushed pink. Shaq leaned forward to help, offering a napkin from the console. "We're good, really," he said gently, though his eyes flicked toward the attendant with mild concern. Behind them came a sharp exhale, a soft huff, and then Carter's voice, muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Should have known better. They're always messy, aren't they?" The words sliced through the air. Shaq felt them before they fully registered, felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck, felt Aaliyah stiffen beside him. She froze, hand still pressing the damp fabric, but her fingers shook now. Her eyes lifted slowly, searching her father's face, looking for some kind of anchor, some kind of answer. Shaq inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for one long second. Not here, not now, not in front of everyone. But his heart pounded harder, and memories flooded in, of the times he'd been followed through luxury stores, assumed to be security instead of the owner, spoken down to by sponsors, sneered at by men who couldn't hold a candle to his success, but wielded the smug arrogance of centuries of unearned privilege. He had learned to carry the weight of those moments, to absorb them without flinching. But this, his daughter, humiliated and insulted, that was a different storm. Aaliyah wiped at her face, blinking fast. "Dad, just let it go," she whispered, voice small but shaking. Shaq turned slightly, meeting her gaze, and gave her the smallest of nods. But inside, his mind was on fire. He looked around the cabin. Some passengers had noticed. Others pretended they hadn't, eyes darting away, headphones pressed in, books lifted higher. That was the way of things. Some would watch, few would intervene. Carter shifted in his seat, smirking faintly, crossing one leg over the other. He sipped from his glass as though he'd said nothing, as though the air wasn't charged and tight with unspoken tension. Shaq sat back, folding his hands together, pressing his fingers hard until the knuckles whitened. He focused on his breathing, steady and slow. This wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. Aaliyah shook her head softly, wiping her hands, trying to calm herself. She sniffed, eyes glistening, but she didn't let the tears fall. Shaq felt his chest twist painfully. How many times had he hoped to shield her from this? How many times had he wanted to believe his success, his platform, his fame would buffer her against the blunt edges of hatred? And yet, here they were, mid-air, trapped in a narrow cabin, surrounded by strangers, and still facing the same old battle. The flight attendant returned, hands shaking, offering fresh napkins, more apologies. Shaq gave her a faint smile, nodding, accepting the effort. But he could feel the ripple running through the rows, the whispers starting, the subtle glances as passengers pieced together what had just happened. He could hear the low hum of tension beneath the engine noise, feel the cabin's collective breath hitch. He leaned back once more, closing his eyes again, but now there was no rest, no escape. His mind raced, looping over every scenario, every possible response. Speak up? Confront Carter directly? Demand the crew step in? But what would that solve? Would they see him as the victim, or would the headlines tomorrow twist it into a tale of an overreacting celebrity? Aaliyah shifted beside him, pulling her knees up slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She didn't look at him, but he saw her reflection faintly in the darkened window. Proud, hurting, holding herself together with trembling strength. Shaq clenched his fists tighter. He knew he couldn't let this pass, not just for himself but for her, for the message it would send if they sat silent. But when, and how? Carter leaned back farther, chuckling softly under his breath, shaking his head. The arrogance radiated off him, thick and sour. He had the look of a man who believed the world would always bend to his comfort. A man who had never faced real consequence. A man who saw Shaq's restraint not as grace, but as weakness. Shaq opened his eyes slowly, exhaling through his nose. He turned his head slightly, meeting Carter's smug gaze for the first time. Their eyes locked for a heartbeat, and in that flicker, the unspoken battle line was drawn. Carter smirked, tipping his glass slightly, as if in mock salute. Shaq gave the smallest, coldest smile back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The air between them crackled, sharp and electric. And though no one in that cabin could say exactly when the tipping point would come, they all felt it coil tighter and tighter, moment by moment, breath by breath. Something was brewing, something that would not, stay contained. Shaq rested his massive hands on the armrests, his heart heavy, his mind sharp. He knew that whatever happened next, they had crossed the line, not the one between seats or classes, but the one between endurance and defiance. And in the skies above, under the bright sun, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, the cracks in civility had begun to spread. Shaq's eyes darted to the window, watching clouds drift lazily by, the sunlight slicing clean through the glass. He felt the tension pulsing at his temples, the burn behind his eyes, but he willed himself to stay calm. Aaliyah shifted next to him, still wiping at the sticky remnants of juice on her hoodie, her face stiff with the effort to not let Carter Winslow's muttered insults sink deeper. Shaq knew she was strong, but she was still young, and the unfairness of it all gnawed at him like a slow acid. He heard the shuffle before he saw it, Carter rising slightly in his seat, his voice cutting across the cabin louder than before, this time no longer pretending to whisper. Figures, Carter drawled, eyes locked on Aaliyah. They can buy their way into first class, but they sure can't buy class itself. The words hit like a whip crack. Shaq's fingers dug into the armrest, his shoulders tensed as if absorbing the blow himself. But before he could rise or even speak, Aaliyah shot to her feet, her chin high, her eyes wet but blazing. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice clear, quivering but defiant. The passengers around them stilled. Conversation stopped, magazines lowered, headphones slipped halfway off. The cabin's air, once filled with quiet hums, now felt pin-drop silent. Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs, part pride, part terror. He wanted to protect her, shield her, but he knew this moment belonged to her first. Carter turned in his seat, facing her fully now, his lips curling into a slow, mocking smile. "You heard me, little girl," he sneered. "You people always think money changes who you are." Shaq's breath caught sharply. His daughter's fists clenched at her sides, her jaw trembling with the effort to stay composed. "You don't know anything about me," she spat back, her voice shaking but strong. Carter's face twisted in something between amusement and disdain. And then, before anyone could process what was happening, His arm snapped up and in one shocking, instinctive, reckless motion, his hand struck Aaliyah's cheek with a sharp, deliberate slap. The sound cracked through the cabin like a lightning strike. Aaliyah stumbled back, a stunned, strangled sound caught in her throat, her hand flying to her face. Shaq was on his feet so fast the seat creaked under the sudden release of pressure, his towering figure casting a long shadow over Carter's seat. His fists clenched, knuckles hard and white, the veins in his arms bulging. His face tightened, his mouth pressed into a flat line, his eyes wild with the sudden surge of rage. But he did not lift a hand. The bodyguards, seated 3 rows back, reacted almost instantly, surging forward down the narrow aisle, their black suits sharp, their faces grim, their presence a wall of controlled force. Passengers gasped, some scrambling to get out of the way, others frozen in wide-eyed shock. Shaq held up a massive hand, halting his men, his voice emerging raw, gravelly, laced with a shaking restraint. "Stand down," he rasped. "I've got this." Aaliyah, tears springing in her eyes now, crumpled back into her seat, her shoulders shaking not just from the sting, but from the humiliation, the betrayal of safety, the crack in her world. Shaq crouched next to her, his big hand gently brushing her hair back, his voice low and trembling as he murmured to her, "I'm right here, baby girl. You're okay." The cabin was still, the silence heavy with tension, every passenger holding their breath, every eye flicking between Shaq's controlled fury and Carter's smug defiance. A flight attendant appeared, her face pale, her voice wavering as she said, "Sir, please take your seat." But her words barely registered over the pounding in Shaq's head. Carter sat back, adjusting his cuffs, smirking faintly as if daring Shaq to lose control. "Go ahead," he muttered. "Prove me right." Shaq rose slowly, towering over the man, his shadow swallowing Carter's seat whole. He inhaled sharply, his massive chest heaving, his eyes locked onto Carter with an intensity that vibrated through the air. He said nothing, not yet, but his presence alone was a force, a pressure that made Carter's smirk falter, just slightly. The passengers sat rigid, their bodies turned toward the drama unfolding like unwilling witnesses. Some clutched their phones, recording in shaky hands, unsure whether they were capturing a confrontation or the spark of something larger. Others avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, willing the moment to pass. Shaq's bodyguards lingered close, eyes scanning the cabin, tense but holding their ground. Shaq took one step closer to Carter's seat, and for a moment, it seemed like the air itself might shatter. But then, his voice, low and firm, cut through the tension. "You think you're safe because you've got money, because you sit here wrapped in privilege," Shaq murmured, his tone razor-sharp but steady. "But you're small, man. So small. You have to slap a girl to feel big." Carter's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching on the armrest. Shaq leaned down slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm not here to play your game. I don't need to hit back to win." He straightened, exhaling slowly, his eyes never leaving Carter's. "You're going to answer for this, not to me but to the people waiting when we land." Aaliyah sniffled softly, wiping her face, her voice small as she whispered, "Dad." Shaq turned to her, crouching again, his massive hand cupping her cheek ever so gently. "I've got you, Lay," he murmured, his voice cracking just a little at the edges. "I swear." The flight crew scrambled into action now, alerting the captain, radioing the ground. The atmosphere shifted from stunned silence to controlled chaos, as whispers swirled, cameras rolled, and the realization spread like wildfire. This was no longer just a cabin dispute. This was a scandal mid-air, and the whole world would soon be watching. Shaq sat back down slowly, his arm around Aaliyah, his body still thrumming with unspent adrenaline, his mind racing with the weight of what had just happened, and what was still to come. Outside, the plane sailed calmly across the bright sky, but inside the storm had only just begun. Captain Rebecca Halloran sat stiffly in her seat, headset pressed to one ear, her other hand clenched around the armrest. The cockpit, usually a sanctuary of control and precision, felt unnervingly small now, boxed in by tension brewing behind the locked door. Her co-pilot, Aaron Fletcher, shot her a glance, eyes asking a question neither of them had wanted to face today. What do we do when the cabin turns into a battlefield? In the main cabin, flight attendants huddled near the galley, their normally polished professionalism fraying at the edges. Some passengers shouted, demanding the man, Carter Winslow, be restrained, escorted to the back, contained. Others muttered under their breath that it was an overreaction, that Shaq's celebrity was stirring up more trouble than necessary, that maybe they all just needed to calm down. The air buzzed with judgment, nerves, and barely hidden fear. Shaq sat still in his seat, his massive frame radiating a tension that didn't come from anger, but from the crushing weight of a choice no one should have to make. He felt Aaliyah's small body trembling against his side, her shoulders shaking as she wept silently, not wanting to make a scene yet, unable to hold it in any longer. His hand rested protectively on her back, anchoring her, though inside he felt himself slipping. He watched the crew's indecision, saw the flickers of panic in their eyes, the whispered debates near the curtain, the clipped phone calls. He knew this dance too well, the one where black pain becomes an inconvenience, where aggression is measured, not by action but by color, where the burden of staying composed always falls on those already injured. He felt the history of it pressing into his chest, thick and suffocating, a reminder that no matter how famous you were, some systems refused to bend. The lead flight attendant, Kendra, approached cautiously, kneeling beside Shaq's seat. Her voice was soft, practiced, tinged with apology. "Mr. O'Neal, we understand this is upsetting, and we want to assure you we're working on it." Her eyes darted briefly to Carter, who now sat back with his arms crossed, smug, one leg bouncing impatiently. "We've spoken to the captain. We're consulting with air traffic control." Shaq turned his head slowly, his voice low, edged with steel. "He assaulted my daughter in front of this entire cabin. What exactly are you working on, Kendra?" "Figuring out how to pretend it didn't happen." Kendra flushed, eyes flickering, but she quickly recovered. "No, sir. We just need to follow proper procedures. Diverting a flight is complicated." In the cockpit, Rebecca's headset crackled with the voice of air traffic control, firm but measured. "Captain Halloran, diverting will require immediate rerouting. Closest option is Denver International. Are you declaring an emergency?" Rebecca exhaled, pressing her thumb against her forehead. "We have a serious onboard incident, but no threat to flight safety. Assault between passengers. We're assessing." She muted the mic, turning to Aaron. "If we divert, we lose time, fuel, create a media circus, maybe spark lawsuits. If we don't, we risk this escalating at 35,000. Aaron frowned, voice calm but clipped. "Either way, this isn't going away quietly." Back in the cabin, the bodyguards stood just beyond Shaq's seat, tense and watchful, their dark suits like silent warnings. They exchanged looks but made no move without Shaq's signal. They knew better. Shaq had always insisted on leading with restraint, on staying human even when the world wanted to dehumanize him. But they also knew there were limits to what a man could swallow. Aaliyah wiped her face, her sobs quieter now, but her hands shook as she clutched her father's sleeve. Shaq leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lee, breathe. You're safe. I promise you." His throat tightened. What kind of promise was that, really? He couldn't change the fact that she'd been hurt in front of an entire plane, couldn't undo the slap, couldn't erase the look on Carter's face when he delivered it. All he could do was stand between her and the next wave of harm. Carter shifted again, now speaking in a loud faux casual voice to the man next to him. "Can you believe this circus? Guy thinks being tall makes him untouchable. Just another spoiled athlete crying for attention." Shaq's jaw flexed. His bodyguards' fists twitched at their sides. Kendra looked ready to faint. The cabin air, once merely tense, had turned electric, every breath feeling sharp, every glance charged with unspoken calculation. Rebecca's voice came over the PA system, calm and authoritative, but Shaq heard the edge of strain beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Halloran. We're currently addressing an onboard passenger situation. We ask for your patience and cooperation. For your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Shaq sat back, closing his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. He knew how this worked. He'd seen it too many times. Power protected power. Reputation weighed heavily, but the difference now was the cameras, the phones pointed from behind headrests, the social media posts already uploading, the headlines already drafting themselves before they even touched down. He opened his eyes, staring straight ahead, and realized with a sudden, painful clarity, this moment was no longer just about him, or even about Aaliyah. It was about every person watching, every parent who'd ever feared for their child, every black family who'd ever had to weigh dignity against survival, every voice that had ever been silenced by procedures and policies designed to delay justice. Rebecca radioed back to air traffic. "We are requesting diversion to Denver. I repeat, requesting diversion. Shaq felt the shift in the cabin, almost instantly. Flight attendants moved with new urgency. Kendra approached again, this time her voice steadier. "Mr. O'Neal, we'll be landing in Denver within the hour. Authorities will meet us at the gate." Shaq nodded once, his eyes flicking briefly to Carter, who now looked less smug, more restless. Aaliyah leaned into her father's side, her breath shaky but slowing. Shaq wrapped his arm around her, his voice soft but sure. "Almost there, baby. Almost there." The plane hummed steadily, slicing through blue skies, but inside, every second felt stretched thin, every moment tight with unspoken stakes. Shaq sat back, breathing deeply, knowing the hardest part wasn't the landing. It was everything that waited on the ground. Shaq sat rigid in his seat, staring ahead, his jaw clenched so tight, it ached. Aaliyah leaned quietly against him, her breathing uneven, her head resting just under his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her reflexively, protectively, but Shaq felt the tremors rippling through him. Not just anger but something deeper, something older, something that had been part of his bones long before this flight, long before this cabin, long before the name Shaquille O'Neal meant anything to the world. His mind raced backward, unbidden. He was 12 again, standing outside the corner store, watching his mother Lucille argue calmly but firmly with a shopkeeper accusing him of stealing gum he hadn't touched. He remembered the heat on his face, the humiliation bubbling just under his skin, and his mother's hand on his shoulder, whispering, "We don't break here, baby. We don't give them what they want." He hadn't understood the depth of that lesson back then. But now, decades later, it pressed hard against his chest, reminding him why he was sitting still when every nerve screamed to rise. He squeezed his eyes shut for a beat, taking a slow, measured breath. Fame, money, championships, endorsements, none of it could protect his daughter from this. He had spent his life believing he could build a world safe enough for her, a fortress made of success and reputation. But here they were, 30,000 feet above the ground, and she had still been slapped across the face by a man who believed she didn't belong. Shaq's fingers flexed, gripping the armrest, until his knuckles turned pale. He could feel the weight of every camera lens, every recording phone, every set of watching eyes. He knew how this worked. The headlines were already forming, and they weren't writing themselves just for Carter Winslow. They were waiting for Shaq to misstep, to let the weight of this storm crack his famous restraint. He leaned his head back against the seat, his heart thudding heavy in his chest, and let his thoughts flicker to all the humiliations he had swallowed over the years. The corporate meetings where executives patted his shoulder like a mascot, the restaurants where reservations were questioned, the subtle digs masked as jokes in media interviews, the fans who praised his talent but never saw his humanity. He had learned to compartmentalize, to smile, to laugh, to be the big man in more ways than one. But none of that armor was holding now, not when it was his child who had been hurt. He tilted his head slightly, glancing down at Aaliyah, whose eyes were closed but whose hand clutched his sleeve so tightly it trembled. He felt the fierce rush of love surge through him, the kind that was primal, unshakable, terrifying in its intensity. He would do anything for her, anything. But here on this flight, surrounded by strangers and cameras and an invisible wall of public scrutiny, he felt pinned in place, the consequences of every move balancing precariously on a knife's edge. His bodyguards hovered nearby, their faces unreadable but their eyes flicking constantly to him, waiting. Shaq met one of their gazes briefly, giving the slightest shake of his head. Not yet. Not here. But inside the storm was mounting, battering against his ribs, coiling tighter with every breath. Shaq's mind flashed to the advice his mother had given him, words that had shaped his public image for decades. "They'll call you angry no matter what. So make sure when you finally speak, it's not just noise, it's truth." He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that restraint was still strength, that waiting for the right moment was wisdom, not cowardice. But as he watched Carter shift casually in his seat, smirking, whispering to his seatmate again, something sharp and dangerous sliced through Shaq's composure. His heart pounded harder, his breath coming quicker now. He felt the weight of the cabin pressing down, the passengers who looked away when Carter struck, the flight attendants who hesitated, the system that always told black men to wait, to be patient, to trust that justice would eventually catch up. He felt a surge of bitterness rise. Uninvited. Why should he wait? Why should he trust? He exhaled roughly, running a hand over his face. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, from the unbearable effort it was taking to hold himself together. He wasn't just Shaq the celebrity here. He was Shaq the father. Shaq the black man. Shaq the human being trying to navigate a moment where every response carried weight and risk. Aaliyah stirred beside him, her voice small, raw. "Dad, what's going to happen when we land?" Shaq's chest clenched. He leaned down, brushing her hair back gently, his voice thick as he whispered, "They're going to meet us. The police, the press, will handle it." He swallowed hard, forcing steadiness into his voice, even though every part of him was trembling. "We're going to stand tall, Lai. You hear me? We stand tall." She nodded slightly, a tear slipping down her cheek, and he caught it with his thumb, his heart twisting painfully. Shaq sat back, eyes closing again, mind racing through every possible move. Should he address the passengers? Should he demand the crew lock Carter down? Should he wait for the authorities? Should he prepare a statement for the press? He felt the crushing weight of expectation, from the world, from himself, from the long aching history of every man who had stood in this place before him. He realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just about making the right move for the cameras or the headlines. This was about his soul, about the kind of man he was, the kind of father he wanted to be, the example he wanted to set for Aaliyah and for anyone else who was watching. His hands relaxed, just slightly. His chest rose and fell, slower now. He was still angry, furious in fact. But the storm inside had begun to shift, to crystallize into something sharper, something more focused. He didn't need to lash out. He didn't need to prove his power through fists or shouting. He needed to be deliberate, unshakable. He turned his head, locking eyes with Carter for a long, measured moment. And in that silence, Shaq made a quiet promise, not just to his daughter, but to himself. When they landed, when the cameras swarmed, when the world demanded answers, he would not flinch. He would speak. And this time, the world would have no choice but to listen. In economy class, a teenager named Jordan Preston sat glued to his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. He had caught the entire moment, the slap, the stunned cabin, Shaq's towering restraint, all of it recorded in a shaky but clear video. He had uploaded it to social media with a simple caption, "Shaquille O'Neal's daughter just got slapped by some guy on my flight." What he didn't realize, as he clicked post and refreshed his feed, was that the digital storm had already begun. The video shot through platforms like a wildfire, igniting outrage, commentary, and breaking news alerts before the plane had even started its descent. Up in first class, Shaq's phone buzzed relentlessly on the armrest. At first he ignored it, focused entirely on Aaliyah, whose fingers were still trembling in his grip. But as the vibrations continued, a steady, urgent hum, Shaq's curiosity flickered. He picked up the phone, unlocking it with his thumbprint, and immediately saw the flood. Messages from friends, family, teammates, sponsors, news alerts, social media pings. The words trending, viral, breaking, flashed across the screen like warning lights on a dashboard. His stomach turned. Shaq opened one of the links, his massive thumb hovering awkwardly over the screen, and watched as the grainy video loaded. There he was, in all his massive presence, looming over Carter's seat. There was Aaliyah, her face crumpling in shock, the cabin's collective intake of breath, the bodyguards bristling to intervene. But most of all, there was the slap, sharp, brutal, unmistakable. Shaq felt his chest tighten painfully as he watched it unfold from an outsider's perspective, the humiliation of the moment, magnified by the knowledge that now millions were watching. Aaliyah leaned over slightly, seeing the screen, her eyes going wide. "Dad, is that?" Her voice cracked, and Shaq instinctively pulled the phone away, shielding her from the worst of it. But the damage was already done. She knew, she understood. This was no longer a private injury. This was a public reckoning. The captain's voice came over the intercom, firm but rattled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Halloran. We are making an unscheduled landing at Denver International due to an onboard incident. Please remain in your seats and follow the crew's instructions." Shaq barely heard the words. His phone was now a battlefield of texts, media requests, and notifications from his PR team. "Shaq, call me now," one urgent message read. Another, from an old teammate, simply said, "We got your back, big man." Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind whirling. He looked down at Aaliyah, whose face was pale but set with quiet determination. She clutched his hand tighter, her grip small but fierce, and he felt a wave of fierce love surge through him. But underneath it came the heavy weight of realization. This wasn't just a father-daughter moment anymore. This was a moment the world had claimed. He turned slightly, locking eyes with his lead bodyguard, Devon, whose sharp gaze hadn't wavered once. Devon gave a small questioning nod, silently asking if Shaq wanted them to step in to shield, to manage. Shaq shook his head just once, a gesture that carried 1,000 unspoken decisions. Not yet. No chaos. Not until they were on the ground. Carter Winslow, oblivious or perhaps emboldened, smirked faintly from his seat, muttering something to his seatmate that made the woman laugh nervously. Shaq didn't bother to listen. He knew the man's time was coming, not through fists or confrontation, but through the relentless machine of public scrutiny, the one Carter no doubt underestimated. Shaq understood how that machine worked. He had been its product, and its prisoner for decades. Another notification buzzed across his phone. NBA legend's daughter assaulted on flight. Exclusive details coming up next, on national news. Shaq's throat went dry. He could already picture the news cycle, the commentators, the hot takes, the political angles, the trolls, the defenders, the opportunists. His reputation wasn't just his own anymore. It was woven into endorsements, contracts, charities, causes, and now his daughter's pain. His every move, every word, every silence, all of it was about to be dissected by people who had no idea what it meant to sit where he sat, to feel what he felt. Aaliyah squeezed his hand again, drawing his attention back. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are we going to do when we land?" Her eyes shimmered, full of fear and trust all tangled together. Shaq leaned down, brushing a soft kiss to her forehead, his voice low but sure. "We're going to do this right, baby girl. We're going to show them what strength looks like." His heart pounded with the sheer magnitude of the moment. But he forced his breath slow, even. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a symbol he had never asked to be, but one he would not abandon. Every instinct screamed to rise, to shout, to demand justice right here, right now. But Shaq knew that wasn't how this worked. The cameras were rolling already, the microphones waiting. He had to choose his next move carefully, not just for himself but for Aaliyah, for every kid watching, for every family holding their breath, hoping to see someone stand tall in the face of injustice. The plane shuddered softly as it began its descent, the fasten seatbelt sign blinking on. Shaq straightened in his seat, his massive frame radiating a calm that belied the storm within. Devon moved slightly closer, eyes sharp on the cabin doors. Other passengers leaned forward in their seats, phones raised, eager to capture the final moments of a flight that had turned into a live broadcast. Shaq's phone buzzed again, this time a message from Lucille, his mother, simple and unwavering. "Keep your head, son. Lead with love." He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the words steady him, anchor him. When he opened them, his gaze met Aaliyah's, and he gave her a small, determined smile. The world was watching. Shaq would give them something worth watching. The descent into Denver had begun, the cabin tilting gently, the lights dimmed just enough to cast long shadows over tense, watching faces. Shaq sat still, his arm wrapped firmly around Aaliyah, feeling her weight against him, her breath shaky but controlled. His phone rested on his lap, its screen dark for now, though the flood of messages continued to vibrate against his leg. The air felt tighter, heavier, each minute crawling by with the pressure of a coiled spring ready to snap. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself when a soft voice interrupted. "Mr. O'Neal?" He opened his eyes to see a young woman standing hesitantly by his seat, a toddler clinging to her leg, thumb in mouth, wide eyes darting nervously between the towering man and his daughter. I just wanted to say," she continued quietly, "I'm so sorry this happened. I saw it. I saw everything. I was back there when it happened." Shaq blinked, his shoulders easing just slightly. The woman offered a tentative smile, her hand brushing her son's curly hair. "My name's Samantha Caldwell. I know I'm just some random passenger, but if you need someone to back you up when we land, I'll be there." Her voice shook slightly, but carried a note of quiet conviction. Shaq felt a small warmth flicker in his chest, a reminder that not everyone in this cabin was pretending not to see. Not everyone was shrinking away from the weight of the moment. He gave Samantha a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said softly, his deep voice rumbling with sincerity. "That means a lot." As Samantha moved away, her son glancing back with big, curious eyes, Shaq became aware of another figure stepping forward, this one more confident, sharply dressed, older, with a polished look that spoke of boardrooms and big deals. Shaq, Julian Brooks. The man introduced himself smoothly, extending a hand that Shaq clasped briefly. I'm in 4C. I saw the whole thing. Carter was way out of line. I'm willing to make a statement, if needed. Don't let anyone tell you this is about anything other than what it is: blatant, ugly prejudice. Shaq raised an eyebrow slightly, feeling the careful weight behind Julian's words. This was a man used to navigating power, a man who recognized not just injustice but the optics of injustice. Still, Shaq appreciated the gesture. Thank you, Julian, he murmured, feeling a subtle shift in the current around him. Allies, he thought. Allies where he hadn't expected them. But even as a few passengers stepped forward in quiet solidarity, Shaq heard the other voices, the ones that never spoke directly to him but whispered just loud enough to poison the air. This is getting blown way out of proportion, a man muttered 2 rows back. Typical celebrity drama, another voice sneered softly. I mean, come on, is this really worth diverting a whole flight? It's just a slap. Shaq's hands clenched tightly on the armrest, the words burrowing under his skin like needles. He fought the surge of frustration rising in his chest, knowing he couldn't afford to react, couldn't afford to give them the show they wanted. But the anger pulsed hot and undeniable. Just a slap, as if his daughter's dignity was some trivial, disposable thing, as if a public assault didn't matter because they were the ones expected to endure. Aaliyah shifted beside him, eyes down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Shaq leaned closer, lowering his voice. You okay, baby? She gave a tiny nod, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I just want to go home, Dad, she whispered. Shaq's throat tightened. We will, he promised softly. We'll get through this, together.
Devin, his lead bodyguard, moved in quietly, leaning down just enough for Shaq to hear.
Security at Denver's being coordinated now. Media's already waiting at the gate. Police too. We'll handle the perimeter, but you should be ready. Shaq gave a faint nod, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Ready. The word echoed in his mind, heavy and loaded. He had been ready his whole life, ready to perform, ready to prove, ready to rise above. But this was different. This wasn't a game or an endorsement, or a photo op. This was his daughter, his family, his name under a microscope. As the cabin tilted slightly again, the final approach beginning, Shaq sat taller, squaring his shoulders. He realized, with a clarity that cut clean through the fog of emotion, that landing wasn't the end of this. It was the beginning. The reporters waiting, the public statements, the legal repercussions, the inevitable online swarm, all of it would follow them long after the wheels touched down. This was a battle that would stretch across days, maybe weeks, and how he walked off this plane would set the tone for everything that followed. A movement to his left caught his eye. Carter Winslow shifting in his seat, crossing his legs with a self-satisfied smirk. The man's arrogance radiated like heat, his posture dripping with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Shaq's jaw tightened. He wanted desperately to confront him, to unleash every word he'd bitten back for the last hour. But he didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he felt Aaliyah's hand slide into his again, small and warm and trembling. He squeezed gently. The plane shuddered softly as the landing gear extended, the distant thump of mechanical preparation echoing beneath the floor. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, checking latches, calming passengers, casting nervous glances toward the front. Shaq exhaled slowly, centering himself. He could feel the battle lines drawing not just outside the plane, but within. There were people in this cabin who saw the truth, who stood with him quietly, unexpectedly, and there were others, muttering, dismissive, unwilling to confront the ugliness they'd just witnessed. Allies and enemies, support and resentment, all tangled together in the narrow space of a pressurized cabin. He took one more breath, glancing at Aaliyah, who sat straighter now, wiping her cheeks with quiet determination. The storm on the ground waited. Shaq knew the real fight was just about to begin. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, its tires groaning against the Denver runway. From the windows, the passengers could already see the chaos waiting outside. Emergency vehicles flanked the jet bridge. Police cruisers lined the tarmac. A huddle of media vans stood clustered just beyond the airport fence, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical vultures. Red and blue lights flashed across the concrete, painting the cabin interior in waves of urgency. Inside, the passengers remained buckled, holding a collective breath, The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but terse. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety please remain seated. Law enforcement will be boarding shortly." Shaq sat perfectly still, one arm around Aaliyah's shoulder, the other resting on his leg, his hand flexing slowly, deliberately. Aaliyah didn't speak. She looked down at her lap, her eyes swollen, her breath even but shallow. Shaq had never seen her like this, not even during the hardest losses, not through injuries or breakups or the cruel words of social media. This was deeper. This was something stolen.
The doors opened with a metallic hiss. First through was a pair of uniformed officers, faces taut with professionalism. Behind them came two plainclothes detectives, and a woman in a sharp navy pantsuit, likely legal counsel from the airline. The officers moved straight to Carter Winslow, who astonishingly didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his brows, as if this whole situation was a minor inconvenience, something that would be resolved with a call to his lawyer.
"You're detaining me?" Carter asked, voice casual, borderline amused. One officer nodded, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault in transit. You'll be advised of your rights in full shortly." Carter looked around as the cuffs clicked on, then unbelievably turned to Shaq with a smirk. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts." Shaq didn't reply. He didn't need to. The weight of what had happened, the video, the outrage, the attention, was no longer something Carter could sneer his way through. As he was led down the aisle, a few passengers applauded softly. Others simply stared. Shaq's gaze followed him until the cuffs disappeared down the jet bridge. Then it was their turn. Airport security approached Shaq next, not as suspects but as the center of the storm. "Mr. O'Neal," said a female officer, her voice gentle but direct. "There's a media presence outside. We can escort you and your daughter to a private exit." "No." Shaq's voice was steady. "I'm not hiding." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. We'll form a perimeter." As Shaq stood, Aaliyah rose slowly beside him. She looked up at her father, searching his face for some clue that things might be okay. Shaq touched her cheek gently and whispered, "You don't have to say anything. Just walk with me." Devin and the other bodyguards closed in, creating a protective flank as they moved down the aisle. Passengers shifted to let them pass, some with murmured encouragement, others with cold, unreadable stares. As they stepped through the open cabin door, the sound hit them like a wave. The roar of cameras clicking, reporters shouting questions, protesters chanting from behind police barriers. Shaq squinted into the sunlight, the dry Denver air sharp and cool against his skin. A security detail ushered them to a designated podium, hastily set up between two police vehicles. Yellow barricades penned in the press. Activists stood in clusters, holding signs that read, "Protect Black Girls," and "Justice Doesn't Fly, Coach." Flashbulbs fired the moment they stepped into view. Shaq kept his posture tall, his steps measured. Aaliyah stayed close, flanked by Devin. When they reached the podium, the chaos crescendoed, questions thrown like grenades.
"Mr. O'Neal, how did it feel to watch your daughter assaulted?"
"Do you think this was racially motivated? Are you planning legal action?" Shaq raised a hand. Slowly, the noise fell to a hush. He looked across the sea of faces, journalists, activists, onlookers, and took a breath that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within his soul. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't need one. "I'm not here today as Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player," he began, voice thick but clear. "I'm here as a father, as a black father, as a man who just watched his daughter be disrespected, humiliated, and struck in front of strangers, and stayed calm because I've been trained my whole life to survive these moments, instead of escalate them." The crowd listened, silent, waiting. "We teach our kids to be strong, to speak up. But when my daughter spoke up, she got hit, and the world saw it. Not because I called attention to it, but because someone brave in the back of the plane recorded the truth." He paused, scanning the crowd, locking eyes with no one, and everyone at once. "There's no first class when it comes to respect. There's no private jet out of racism. I thought maybe my success could shelter my children. I was wrong. My daughter's tears were real. Her fear was real, and I will not be silent about it." Aaliyah looked up at him, eyes wide, listening again. Shaq placed a hand on her back. "Steady. I want accountability. Yes. But more than that, I want change. I want our daughters, all our daughters, to know they don't have to shrink to stay safe, that their worth isn't negotiable, that their skin doesn't make them less, that silence is not the price of peace. A murmur ran through the crowd, not outrage this time, but something closer to awe. Shaq stepped back. Done. No more words. Just truth. Reporters shouted after him, but he didn't respond. He reached for Aaliyah's hand, and together they walked past the flashing cameras, down the tarmac, into the awaiting SUV. He didn't feel victorious. He felt exposed. Raw, but also resolute, because this wasn't over. But it had started in the right place. Not with fists, not with fear, with clarity, with courage, and most of all, with love. Night fell over Denver, but the world outside Shaq's hotel window was anything but quiet. Headlines screamed from every news network: NBA legend's daughter assaulted on flight. Air rage or hate crime. The internet weighs in. Shaq breaks silence. A father's call for justice. His phone, still vibrating occasionally on the nightstand, had been buzzing non-stop since they left the airport. Messages from teammates, old friends, activists, celebrities, family, and mixed in, the harsher currents, the backlash, the undercurrent of ugliness that always lurked just beneath the surface when a black man spoke too boldly about injustice. Shaq sat on the edge of the bed, his massive frame hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the muted TV screen where a panel of commentators debated the footage that had gone viral. Aaliyah lay curled under the hotel room blankets, her breathing soft and even now, finally asleep after a long, harrowing day. He watched her for a long moment, his heart pulling tight in his chest. She was safe, physically, but inside he knew something deeper had been cracked, and he knew, without question, this was only the beginning. On the screen, one commentator leaned forward, voice sharp. "Let's not forget, folks, we're talking about a celebrity here. Is this really about race? Or is it about fame? Are we sure this wasn't just a simple dispute blown out of proportion because of who was involved?" Shaq closed his eyes, jaw clenching. He could already hear the trolls, the hashtags twisting the story, the social media warriors dissecting every move he'd made on that plane, every word of his tarmac speech. He could hear the whispers of corporate sponsors nervously calculating risk, the executives wondering if this would stain endorsements, the PR teams drafting polished statements of support while quietly debating what to cut loose. But when he opened his eyes again, his gaze went back to Aaliyah, to the steady rise and fall of her small chest beneath the covers, to the way she clutched one of his oversized sweatshirts like a lifeline. And in that moment, none of the noise outside mattered. Not the headlines, not the commentary, not the trolls, not even the sponsors. What mattered was the promise he was shaping in his chest, the one that had nothing to do with contracts or camera angles, or courtroom. He stood slowly, moving to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out at the city lights below. Denver sparkled beneath him, alive and indifferent, the world humming along as if nothing had changed. But Shaq knew, for him, for Aaliyah, something fundamental, something that couldn't be undone. His phone lit up again, another headline scrolling across the notifications. Public divided over Shaq confrontation. Hero or overreacting star. Shaq let out a low, bitter breath. He had been through enough in his life to know how fickle public opinion was, how fast the wind could shift. Today's champion was tomorrow's cautionary tale. It didn't matter that his daughter had been hurt, that he had stayed calm, that he had spoken with love instead of rage. To some he was already too loud, too visible, too willing to make it about race. To others he hadn't gone far enough, hadn't pushed back hard enough, hadn't called out names. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He thought about Lucille, his mother who had texted earlier, her words sharp and warm all at once. "They'll try to spin it, son. Let them. You know your truth." And he did, but knowing it didn't make it easier to carry. He sat back on the edge of the bed, lowering his head into his hands, letting the weight of the day settle fully over him. He thought about every time he had swallowed his pride, every time he had smiled through a slight, every time he had measured his words to keep sponsors happy, fans content, executives calm. And now here he was, not as Shaq the legend, the millionaire media giant, but as Shaq the father, sitting in a hotel room beside his sleeping daughter, wondering how to protect her not from one man on a plane but from the vast grinding machine of a world that would tell her, over and over, that her pain was negotiable. A soft sound stirred him. Aaliyah shifted slightly, murmuring in her sleep, her brow furrowed, as if the weight of the day still lingered in her dreams. Shaq reached out gently, smoothing her hair back, his fingers trembling slightly, the raw motion of it all threatening to crack through. "I'll never stop fighting for you," he whispered, barely audible, his voice thick. "Never." He stayed like that for a long time, hand resting lightly on her head, staring into the quiet, darkened room. In the morning there would be interviews. There would be statements to craft, legal teams to meet, strategies to plan. There would be supporters to rally, critics to answer, and decisions to make about how far to push, how loudly to demand. But tonight, there was only this: a father, his daughter, and the quiet, unshakable promise that no matter what the world threw at them, no matter how long the road ahead, he would not let her stand alone. Outside, the city buzzed, the news cycle churned, the hashtags trended and twisted. But in that room, Shaquille O'Neal made his stand. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for the girl who had clung to his arm on a flight turned nightmare. For the child who carried his name, and his hopes, and his legacy. He would fight, and this time, he wouldn't fight for points, or titles, or applause. He would fight for her, for as long as it took, for as long as he had breath. The late afternoon sun poured over the city square, its golden light slanting across banners, posters, and faces gathered in restless anticipation. The hum of the crowd filled the air, families, activists, students, elders, reporters, all pressing toward the makeshift stage set at the center. A line of cameras ringed the space, lenses trained on the tall, unmistakable figure standing near the edge of the platform. Shaquille O'Neal adjusted the microphone in front of him, feeling its cool metal beneath his massive hand. His chest rose and fell slowly, his gaze scanning the sea of people. He wasn't wearing a suit or a jersey, no celebrity flash, no polished image, just jeans, a black t-shirt, and a weight on his shoulders that no stylist or manager could ever lift. Beside him, his mother Lucille gripped his arm, her fingers strong, steady, grounding him. She had flown in the moment she saw the news, her voice over the phone sharp with both worry and pride. "You know you have to speak, son. You know they need to hear you, not the world's Shaq, but my Shaq." And here he stood, not as a basketball icon, not as an entertainer, but as a father, raw and human, determined to turn his family's pain into something more than headlines. The crowd settled as the MC stepped back, ceding the stage. Shaq took a slow step forward, the boards creaking softly under his weight. His eyes flicked to the front row, where Aaliyah sat between her grandmother and Devin, her face still tender, the faint shadow of the slap barely visible, her chin lifted just enough to break his heart all over again. Shaq exhaled, leaned slightly toward the microphone, and began. "When I was a kid," he said, his deep voice rough but clear, "my mother taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. She said, there's two kinds of strength, son, the strength to win, and the strength to stand." He paused, letting the words settle, the crowd leaning in. "I learned how to win on the court. I learned how to stand today." A ripple ran through the audience. A wave of quiet affirmation, people nodding, gripping signs tighter, wiping their eyes. "I'm standing here not because I'm famous, not because I'm rich, not because I can dunk a basketball or sell sneakers," Shaq continued, his voice gaining power, "but because I'm a father who watched his daughter be hurt in front of the world, and realized that no amount of fame, no amount of polite silence can shield her, or any of our kids from hate." He gripped the edges of the podium, his shoulders tight. What happened on that plane wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about Aaliyah. It was about the millions of parents, the millions of families, who live every day, knowing that their children will be judged, not for their character, but for the color of their skin. And I'm here to tell you, we're done waiting quietly. We're done asking nicely. We're done sitting still while the world tells us to calm down, when we demand basic respect. The crowd stirred, voices rising in soft, supportive murmurs. Lucille squeezed his arm once, and Shaq pressed on. "I want to make something clear. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about dragging one man's name through the mud. It's about making sure that when our daughters, black, brown, white, any color, stand up for themselves, they don't have to fear being struck down. It's about making sure that no father has to sit frozen in his seat, forced to choose between protecting his child and protecting his reputation." His voice cracked slightly, but he steadied it. "I promise you this. I will not stop fighting. I will not stop speaking. I will not stop showing up, even when the cameras leave, even when the headlines fade. Because this isn't just a moment. This is a movement. And every single one of you here today, you're part of it. Applause rippled outward, building, gaining strength. Aaliyah sat straighter, her eyes shining. Shaq glanced down at her, his heart squeezing, then turned back to the crowd. My daughter asked me last night, "Dad, why do people hate us when they don't even know us?" And I didn't have a good answer. Because the truth is, hate doesn't need a reason. But love does. Love requires action. It requires courage. It requires standing up when it's uncomfortable, speaking out when it's dangerous, and refusing to be silent when silence feels safe. He stepped back from the microphone slightly, his chest heaving, his eyes sweeping the crowd. So I'm asking you, all of you, let's stand together. Let's raise our voices. Let's make sure that the next time someone tries to dismiss or dehumanize our children, they're met not with silence but with a wall of love, strength, and unity that they cannot break. The crowd roared. Now, cheers rising, hands clapping, fists lifting. Shaq felt Lucille's hand grip his tightly, felt Aaliyah's eyes on him, felt the weight on his shoulders shift, just slightly, as if shared now by the hundreds gathered, by the thousands watching, by the countless families who understood this fight in their own bones. He stepped back from the podium, not as a man retreating but as a man passing the torch, inviting others forward. Civil rights leaders moved up beside him. Local activists clasped his hand. Photographers flashed, but Shaq barely noticed. He turned, crouching slightly, and opened his arms as Aaliyah rushed forward, wrapping herself around him in a tight, trembling hug. He closed his eyes, burying his face in her hair, whispering softly so only she could hear, "We're not alone, baby. We're never alone." As they stood together, the crowd's cheers surging behind them, the sky above turned a deep, brilliant gold, the light lingering as if unwilling to fade. The fight wasn't over, but Shaq, his family, and his community were ready. And in that moment, surrounded by love, hope, and fierce determination, Shaq understood one unshakable truth: no fame, no fortune, no force on earth could silence a father's love, or his promise to fight for justice, no matter how long the road ahead. If this story stirred something in you, let it be more than a passing headline. Let it spark a conversation at your table, in your community, in your heart. Ask yourself, what would you stand for when no cameras are rolling? Remember, real change doesn't come from watching. It comes from showing up, speaking out, and refusing to look away. Because justice isn't a spectator sport. It's a commitment we all carry.